My name is Steve Bray. I was born in Brunei and I grew up in the Malaysian part of Borneo. My parents were working with local Malaysian churches. They were telling people about Jesus and working with local pastors. I came back to Australia when I was about 13 in Year 8, and my faith life, I suppose, was fairly impacted by my parents. They had a big impact on the way that I thought about life. But as I grew older, I made my own commitments, and I continue to need to make new and relevant commitments for where I am at the time. My life has unfolded in lots of different ways that I wouldn't have expected, and God has been there in many different ways. The understanding that I have of who God is and how He's rescued me, how He relates to me, how He relates to the world, and how He wants me to relate to the world is growing. I'm on a journey working out how all that works. I met Lynda through her sister, who was a good friend of mine. We've been married for over 16 years now, and she's an amazing woman. For a number of reasons, it took us a fair while to have kids. It wasn't straightforward, and we went through some difficult times. Looking back now at the three wonderful kids, Emma, Sarah and Jack, that we have, I've just got to keep on thanking God for His blessing in that, because it certainly wasn't straightforward. It came completely out of the blue. Over 8 years ago, I had just finished up studying, and I had just taken on a new role as a staff trainer with the Salvation Army Employment Plus. We had a 2-year-old and a 5-month-year-old, that was Emma and Sarah. I was attending a conference and I started feeling a bit sick and started to get a bit of pain. And within about half an hour I was at an RPA hospital. I had pancreatitis. And it was acute idiopathic necrotizing pancreatitis. And that basically means that I had an inflammation of the pancreas. And it came on suddenly and without any known cause. I was barely aware what a pancreas was at that stage. That episode actually destroyed my pancreas, and I was in hospital in a great deal of pain for much of the next 6 months. And I lost over 30 kilos, and I became a diabetic as a result. There were many times when it was touch and go. One thing I remember was that I wasn't worried about where I'd go when I died. I knew that I'd be with God, but I desperately didn't want to go. I wanted to be around for a while longer. I had a family, and I really wanted to be with them. I went back to work part-time, and we started to put our life back together. We moved. I was still in pain, but I learnt to live with it. And about 2 years later, we had a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old, Jack. We were now living in Hurstville, and we were attending Blakehurst Baptist. I was still spending a lot of time in hospital on a regular basis, and I had a couple of medical warning signs, and I ended up at Concord Hospital. I was fairly relaxed about what was happening, and I had a few scans and tests, and then basically woke up about 2 weeks later.
So we had to ask Grae and Stu if they'd take Steve into the hospital, because I had the 3 kids. Jack was still a baby, and Steve was pretty relaxed about going to hospital because no one seemed particularly worried. He was just going in for some scans and some tests to see what was happening with his body. So the first thing we know is through the night I get a phone call from Concord Hospital saying that my husband's bleeding internally, he's vomiting blood. There's nothing I can do, so not to come in just yet, but to just wait until morning and see what happens. So in a bit of a panic, I think, all I can remember is I rang Grae to let him know. I'm not sure if I rang my parents. Maybe I rang my parents as well. But then I just went back to bed, just waiting for this phone call, which I'd waited for on previous occasions, to come saying that Steve had passed away. In the morning, the hospital rang me again to say, did I know the situation with my husband? And I told them what I'd been told the night before. And they said that, I needed to come in. I needed to make arrangements to come in because things weren't looking too good. Now, when I got there, I remember meeting Steve's brother there, and we were shown to a quiet room, and I remember thinking, this isn't going to be a quiet room for very long. And they came and explained to us that Steve was bleeding internally. And basically I remember speaking to a doctor, and he was kind of assessing how much effort, this was my opinion, how much effort was this person worth, in a sense, to save him. And so I told him he was a father of 3 young children. He still had lots of life to live, and it was just a funny sensation that somebody's worth was kind of being weighed up at that point. But then they said they were going to have to do scans and operate and see where the bleed was. And I remember them taking, I think, about 4 hours to find the source of the bleed, and then I think another 4 hours or so to fix it. And then that happened again that next night. He started bleeding again, and so they went in again and they found it, and they fixed it. And what actually happened was they had to cut off one of the liver supplies of blood to the liver. They had to block off the hepatic artery, which was one of 2 blood supplies. Now, in Steve's previous brush with death, I guess, with his first pancreatitis attack, he had lost the portal vein, which is the other blood supply to the liver. So that at this point in time, we had no blood supply to the liver. So the next thought was that they were going to have to do a liver transplant. Okay, so before we left Concord Hospital, we'd found out that, or what had actually happened was that Steve had died twice on the table and had been revived. We found out that he'd used a phenomenal amount of blood just in transfusing him to keep him alive. And we'd also gone through that whole mental game, I guess, of pretty soon I'm probably going to be asked to sign off on donating Steve's organs, because at that point we were quite sure that he wasn't going to make it, or it was a very real possibility. So, then we found out that he has been saved for now, but there's every likelihood that he will need a liver transplant. So they put him in an ambulance, and the ambulance went oh so slowly and oh so quietly over to RPA, which was a bit of a relief, because Steve's specialist, Dr. Gallagher, was there, and we really respected him because he'd saved his life last time during the pancreatitis attack. So getting to RPA, Steve was still in a coma. He was still in a medically induced coma. Instead of thinking of the fact that Steve was going to be an organ donor, we had to then deal with the fact that he needed a liver, probably. And how do you pray for that? You don't want to pray that somebody else's life is going to be ended so that your husband can have a liver. So that was a very interesting situation to be in. But then we received the news that actually the way things had gone, even though both his blood supplies to his liver had been compromised, the way that it happened the first time, his body had compensated, and his portal vein had actually developed lots of little mini veins, I guess, and his liver actually had enough blood to be healthy. So that was a real answer to prayer, but it felt like kind of we're being a pancake flipped over and over, dealing with this situation then that situation. So then they decided to bring him out of the coma, the drug-induced coma, and we found that he wasn't responding to any instructions given, and the doctor said that it was likely that Steve had some sort of brain damage. We weren't sure of the level of it, but it was the part where he thought that was the part that was affected. And but all of this time, whenever they brought him out of the coma, Steve was pulling at the tube that was down his throat that was helping him to breathe. And it was time for that tube to be replaced. And I asked that instead of the tube being replaced in his throat, if he could have a tracheotomy. And that night, before it was put in, Blakehurst also got together and had a prayer night And the next morning they took his tube out, they put the tracheotomy in, and that's when things really turned around. The first thing we knew was that Steve had regained consciousness when they brought him out of the coma. He was communicating with people, and suddenly the situation was a whole lot different. And I remember sitting in was it ICU? I think it was, he was still in ICU, so I don't know if it was ICU, it was just his own. He actually had more than one nurse on him. So it was some room where there were lots of medical staff, and the nurse just sort of started, I don't think she swore, but she was just going, "I don't believe this," in the corner. And I'm saying, what is it? And she's saying, all his blood works are coming back in the normal range. So Steve and I just had to point upwards and say, this is God. And when the doctor said, we can't tell you why this has happened, we just said, it's God. It's God's work.
I guess I've only really experienced those 2 weeks through the eyes of other people, like Lynda. On waking up, I heard how Lynda and my extended family had been there through many dark times, and we're very blessed with supportive families. I heard how everyone had been worrying and praying and caring. When I got home, I saw how our family had been just wrapped up in the arms of the church. People would take the kids to wherever they needed to be. Meals would turn up the door, and we knew people were praying. In some ways, those experiences didn't really have the effect that it seemed like they should have. I didn't have any amazing experience that radically changed my life. What I did have was a reinforcement that God was God, that I don't own my own life, that life is still a journey, and that I'm incredibly blessed with a wonderful family, that I need to continue to be faithful, and that God will always be faithful.
I think at that point of my life, my faith had developed to a point where I knew that good and bad things happen to all people, believers and non-believers. And I think there's a very good reason for that. I think, how can we talk to people who don't believe in God about really hard things in life when we haven't experienced those things? And I learnt that God hasn't promised to protect us from those things, but what he has promised is that good will come out of that situation for those who trust in God. And so I didn't spend any energy wondering, why has God allowed this to happen? Has he made it happen? Is it just life happening? Which are all questions I've spent a lot of energy on in the past trying to deal with, because at that point in time, it doesn't matter to me. It didn't matter to me whether God made it happen, whether it happened as part of life, or whether God allowed it to happen. It happened, and God had promised that he would be with me through that. And I found that I didn't have unrealistic expectations of what could happen with Steve. There was a very real possibility that he would die, but I also knew that that would somehow bring glory to God. And my faith is about being on God's team and God doing whatever he needs to do for us to play this game of life and to be witnesses for him and for people to come to know him. So there will be hard times, but he's going to give me what I need to get through it, and he's going to bring glory out of it. Now, I didn't want that to happen. I didn't want Steve to die, but I just had a reassurance that things would be okay. And I remember it was at RPA, because the jacarandas were outside the window, and I remember I was just sitting at Steve's bedside before we knew what was going to happen. I think at the point where maybe he was brain damaged, we thought he would be brain damaged, and I just felt a real sense of praise for God, and I was just worshipping God. And I think it was purely because I knew things were going to be okay whatever happened to Steve. I think another lesson I've learnt through it, I think after Steve's come home and we've had to live with the consequences of having someone who's ill in the family, is that I've had to learn to take care of myself and also to keep energy in reserve. I think before I was always of the opinion that you need to go all out for God and use every minute doing something for God. But I think part of that doing is in taking care of my family, and in order to do that I have to rest, and I have to make sure that if Steve gets sick, or if any of us get sick, we need to have something in reserve to give to our families. So that's an important lesson that I've learned. And to deal with the guilt that I'm not doing all the time, I think that's another thing I've had to learn and let go of, that we can relax in God and He's okay with that.